All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar, Coming of Age, Young Women's Lives in Early 19th Century New England. My name is Brittany Jaarsma, and I am the Collections and Research Program Coordinator and Collections Photographer here at Old Sturbridge Village. And tonight, my colleague, Rebecca Beall, our Curator of Textiles and Collections Manager, and I will discuss the options that were available for young women in the early 19th century. Before we begin, I will start us off with a land acknowledgement. Old Sturbridge Village is located on the traditional land of the Nipmuc peoples. New England and the rest of the United States consists of land expropriated from Native American peoples. We honor the land and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded it throughout the generations and continue to steward it today. Our region and our country have been shaped by a history of colonization, racism, and oppression. We acknowledge those who have come before us and those who continue to fight injustice today. We recognize our responsibility to fully understand the past and, together with the Nipmuc peoples, build toward a peaceful, inclusive, and equitable future. Thank you. So I have a few more things to share before we begin. This program is being recorded and it will be posted on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page, which I encourage you all to visit. There will also be a question and answer session following our discussion tonight. So I invite all of our live viewers to submit questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom center of your screen. And now, without further ado, I will get things started. So tonight we will take you through a woman's life, starting with their childhood, discussing what kinds of things they may have learned at home and at school. We will then discuss this transition to young adulthood and some of the options that were available for women at the time. And then we will end with a brief discussion of married life and young motherhood. And now I will pass things on to Rebecca.
Excellent. So thank you all for joining us, as Brittany said. And really, when we were talking about this topic, to understand the coming of age in early 19th century New England, it's really important to realize how much young women's lives and the transition from youth to adulthood was really influenced by childhood experiences and education. So like today, and you're going to hear this throughout the presentation, we're focusing on a fairly homogenous sort of view, but children in the 19th century had vastly different experiences in childhood and growing up, depending on a variety of factors like today, economic status, whether you are urban or rural, your family makeup and their beliefs. So kind of bearing that in mind, childhood was really becoming increasingly recognized in the early 19th century as a particularly influential stage that was distinctly different from infancy and young adulthood. Childhood was really a foundational time of reinforcing societal expectations and appropriate spheres through education, through work and play. And a lot of early 19th century advice books, which are becoming more and more prolific, are really advocating for this childhood sort of time to be a measure of freedom and understanding that children must and should be children still, and it's our duty to sympathize with them as such. Lucy Larcom, one of our favorites, who you're going to hear a lot about throughout the presentation, was an author and authored A New England Girlhood, which she published in 1889. And she's looking back at her time growing up in New England in our time period. And she dedicated that book to girls of all ages. But she remembered that they were a neighborhood of large families, and most of us enjoyed the privilege of a little wholesome neglect. So AKA freedom to play and to explore their environment. She, of course, was growing up in Massachusetts, near Lowell, Massachusetts. Another person that you're going to hear a lot about tonight, one of my favorites, author Lydia Maria Child, who was a noted advice book author, writing The Mother's Own Book in the American Frugal Housewife, tripping over my own tongue this evening. Said that in this country, we're apt to let children romp away their existence until they get to be 13 or 14. So again, kind of advocating for that freedom to let children explore their environment. And there really was a growing acknowledgement that children of both genders needed this time to explore and to learn through play, through gentle guidance, but also through some structured routine as well. And gender roles were absolutely embedded in their education, in their work and play from a really very young age. So that starts with schooling, of course. And in New England, public schooling was readily available, and hopefully the slide will advance. Excellent. So public schools were free to attend, district schools for both boys and girls. And often the reality of large families, such as the ones Lucy Larcom was mentioning, meant that younger children were often sent to school with older siblings, simply to allow their mothers to have a little uninterrupted time for domestic work. So Lucy herself remembered starting school at the tender age of 2, as other children about us did. And the mothers of large families had to resort to some means of keeping their little ones out of mischief, she said. But that's not to say that small children didn't receive some benefit to this early schooling or instruction. Another author, Susan Blunt, who also wrote a reminiscence of her childhood, this time in New Hampshire, called Childish Things, recollected that small children were going to a little private school in the winter where we were taught to read and spell and knit. And the first thing a child learned there was the alphabet and abbreviations and definitions and the multiplication table. So she is also remembering that she's going very young, but they are starting to actually instruct these little ones in the basics. So the reality for a lot of district schools, though, is that there was a wide range of ages, and it would not be uncommon for a rural district school to have scholars as young as 2 or 3, all the way up through their late teens, often in one room together, both boys and girls in the same room. And that meant that the instruction beyond some of that early instruction that the little ones get was done more by rote or memorization from books that scholars were bringing with them. So the school is really more kept by a school keeper, man or woman in this case, rather than a school teacher that we might think of today. But you'll learn a little bit more about other areas where more instruction is happening. So school for the sort of district schools was typically in session in the winter and summer. Spring and fall were really busy agricultural seasons. Summer was generally a little less attended. A lot of the older children, especially the boys, were still needed for their labor. So it kind of skewed younger and a little more female in the summer. But both boys and girls would have been learning the same subjects: reading, writing, basic math, other subjects depending on what books they're bringing with them. And again, author Larry Child, my favorite, recommended first be sure that children are familiar with all the duties of their present situation by schools, by reading, by conversation. Give them as much knowledge as you can. So there was a general understanding that basic education was really important equally for both boys and girls for future jobs for boys, but as well as for girls, the duties of managing domestic household management and eventually raising young children of their own. So as you'll hear later, schooling didn't necessarily end with the district school, although certainly for a lot of folks it did. And young ladies definitely had other opportunities for further education beyond this district school. So the scholastic education, of course, was not the only education that a girl was receiving. Domestic education was also being started at a very young age. And children were expected to contribute to the household work as their age and ability allowed. So this often meant that young children were instructed in basic sewing and knitting and other household tasks, cleaning, assisting with kitchen chores, as soon as they were capable, so as young as 3 or 4 in some cases. And from this young age, gender roles were definitely being reinforced as girls would have been taught and expected to help with domestic household tasks that would eventually become their domain in adulthood. So societal norms encouraged the idea that girls would grow up and marry and raise children and keep households of their own. And thus, these duties were as much about helping with household labor in the family, but they were also certainly helping with the training, educating of girls for their sort of future role as wife and mother, as society expected. So even though advice literature was increasingly recognizing childhood as a time of play and exploration, the realities for many families, especially agricultural families, meant that the children's household labor was invaluable and really necessary to kind of the smooth functioning of the household. So again, Susan Blunt remembered when she was 10, and mind you, this is 10 years old, a woman who lived about a mile from us, she wrote, came to see mother. She wanted her to let me go and keep house for her for a week. She had 2 little girls and her aged father to leave in my care. And then Susan proceeds to detail cooking and getting water and cleaning and basically running the household for this woman while she is gone, physically gone out of the house for a week. And this is happening at 10 years old. So I don't know too many 10-year-olds today who we might trust with keeping house for a week all by themselves. But certainly that was something that Susan remembered being responsible enough to do. And to quote Lydia Child again, education is never finished and the knowledge of domestic abilities is beyond all price to a woman. And the earlier this knowledge is instilled in young girls, the better. So she says when a girl is about 9 or 10, she should be accustomed to take some regular share in household duties. And as Susan proved, she certainly was capable. So kind of putting it into perspective, the sampler on the screen here is one of 2 that we have by this maker, Mary Arnold. She grew up in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. The first one she made is a much simpler one that she made when she was 8 years old. This one she made when she was 10 years old. And so this is really a skill, along with others you see on the screen there, an herb crusher, kind of representing the help that the girls would be in the kitchen to their mothers washing is a big chore. So all of these things are really being instilled from a very young age. And you'll hear a little bit more about further education, but it's kind of interesting to note that Mary herself did go on to a further education. She attended both Dudley and Munson academies later in the 1830s. So this one was made in 1823. So think, about 10 years or so after, 7 to 10 years after, she's also furthering her education. And it should also be noted, just like today, that not all girls were interested or successful at their domestic education. Some did not like it at all, even though from it was expected that they would at least kind of reach some competency. On more than one occasion, Lucy Larcombe expressed a dislike of sewing and remembered a kind of a sense of horror when she realized that she would have to sew garments for an eventual family, and saying that when she realized that, life hardly seemed worth living. Another author, again, writing about her childhood in the early 19th century, Sarah Anna Emery, reminisced about her dislike of cooking. And she noted that she'd rather devote her time to reading and writing. And then another girl in Orange, Massachusetts, Brenda Mayo, we've got her sort of very short reminiscence, was kind of a born rogue. She said in her book, or her little memoir, I was a born rogue. And as soon as I began to have the use of my hands, I began burning and eating and wasting everything that came my way. And she recounted all sorts of sort of very interesting sort of episodes in her life that are definitely kind of counter to this sort of expectation of well-behaved little girls learning all of these things from their mothers. So like we said before, it's definitely a range of experiences that girls are having, and they didn't all fit into this sort of ideal mold that society thought they should. So play, though, going back to kind of another instructional tool, it was a very powerful tool that, again, is reinforcing a lot of these gendered expectations. So on the screen here, you see a variety of different toys that would have been played with by little girls. And again, many advice book authors in the early 19th century advocated for the power of play in growth and development and the education of children. So toys like dolls, toy dishes, and stoves, sewing activities, maybe making clothes for your dolls, were all considered really appropriate pursuits for girls and kind of ways to begin emphasizing the life skills and gender roles that they would be adopting later in life. Lydia Maria Child noted that dolls, unlike some critiques, didn't instill a love of finery, but rather encouraged sewing skills, domestic skills, neatness, attention to detail, exercising the affections, presumably encouraging maternal affections as the little girls are caring for their dolls. So it's really interesting to see how much play even is influencing the experience of girls versus boys. And of course, boys like the girl's own book and its counterpoint, the boy's own book, showed a very distinct difference and what was considered appropriate play for girls versus young boys. So the girls had sections on sewing and charades and ladylike calisthenics, and boys had chapters on chemical amusements and coarser, rougher play. So you can see on the screen here, on one side, you've got graces and you've got jump rope and you've got these very sort of ladylike, albeit outside activities. And the boys get to play leapfrog and run races and go swimming. And so a lot of different, even in play, ways to kind of separate the two spheres and what's appropriate for girls and what's appropriate for young boys. So everything in childhood really reinforced and underscored the gender spheres. And that's happening in their dress as well. So as you probably know, boys and girls up until the age of, say, 3 or 4 or 5, depending on the particular time period you're talking about, were dressed much as little Sarah Davis Burr in some kind of gown, loose fitting. But as they transitioned, the girls' dresses become much more in line with adult fashions. So you'll start to see details that kind of bring it more in line with what the adult women are wearing. And then by the end there, you have our lovely picture, who's probably Harriet Thompson, possibly painted by her father there, and much more in line with what you see adult women wearing. So her hair is now up. She's looking very prim and very proper. And her dress is probably, even though you can't really see it, the skirts are lengthening, and she's probably leaving off things like the pantalettes that a younger girl might be wearing. So you really see quite the progression in just these 3 portraits from our collection, from that sort of toddler stage all the way up through kind of probably, I would guess, the girl in the middle, maybe 10 or 12 years old, we might call tweens today, and then all the way up into sort of young ladyhood, 16, 17, 18 years old, or early 20s. And kind of to put a sort of cap on, well, it varied from girl to girl. There was a transition from childhood into kind of young adulthood. Susan Blunt remembered that, and in May 15th, 1843, I celebrated my 15th birthday by getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning and doing a large washing and then going with some of the girls to the city to see the sights, as I was now a young woman and done with childish things. So for Susan, it happened when she turned 15, kind of leaving behind childhood and heading into young adulthood. But as you'll hear, it really varied a little bit, that sort of next stage in life and when that starts.
Right. So in the 19th century, free-born Americans left home, completed school, started paid work, and married at widely varying ages, ranging from their early teens to their late 20s. Indeed, until into the 20th century, significant numbers of people, enslaved and free, did not know how old they were. Instead, they thought of life in a series of distinct stages and as an ongoing journey. In 1830, the voting age for men was qualified at 21 years old, at which they were considered adults. However, there was no specific legal age at which a woman was considered an adult. In fact, many feminists believe that women and people of color were kept as children their whole lives because they did not have the same rights available to white men. So this brings us to the question, when did a young girl transition to adulthood? As our lithograph here shows the life and age of women, it kind of shows those distinct ages that they would think of life as. A girl learns and prepares for being a mother. She ripens into her beauty and then becomes a wife and mother and then a pious old woman. This is a very white middle class view of what the life of a woman looked like in the 19th century. And like today, people lived very different and varying lives. What is most interesting about the lithograph is the text at the bottom, which gives each stage of life a relative age and description. And these lithographs were very common, and the ages really depended and varied on the lithograph. For this one, according to the lithograph, 18 seems to be the year in which a female child becomes a young adult. It states that this may be considered the most critical age in the life of a female. Left to her own instructions, she looks forward to the future in the fondest hopes. While by the age of 30, she is considered an adult. The lithograph states a woman may be considered at the zenith of her intellectual and physical powers. Having seen the folly often attendant on the conduct of the young, she directs her thoughts, if joined in wedlock, to the interests of her family. So here we can see this distinct phase of life for women between the ages of roughly 18 to 30. Young women are able to think about their futures and their own interests until they must marry and turn their thoughts to their family. And the early 19th century provided women additional opportunities during their young adulthood. In her book, New England Girlhood, again by Lucy Larcom, she provides a look into the mind of a young girl in the early 19th century. She writes, "In the older times, it was seldom said to little girls, as it has always been said to boys, that they ought to have some definite plan while they were children what to be and do when they were grown up. There was usually but one path open before them, to become good wives and housekeepers, and the ambition of most girls was to follow their mother's footsteps in this direction, a natural and laudable ambition. But girls, as well as boys, must often have been conscious of their own peculiar capabilities, must have desired to cultivate and make use of their individual powers. When I was growing up, they had already begun to be encouraged to do so. We were often told that it was our duty to develop any talent we might possess, or at least to learn how to do some one thing which the world needed, or which would make it a pleasanter world." So Lucy points to the fact that women were encouraged to think about their next stage in life after childhood. Many, if not all, were of course encouraged to marry, but there was this period of time that women could develop any talent they might possess. They could form friendships, attend school or work, and this was not as prevalent in the 18th century and was increasingly accessible after the American Revolution. So the American Revolution brought up many ideas of who was actually free. Women did their part in the founding of the nation, often acting outside of their traditional gender roles, including taking part in political discourse. But despite their role in the revolution, women did not get the same freedoms given to white men. However, they did garner a position of respect within American society. This concept of Republican motherhood was established in the years following the revolution, and women's political energy was channeled into educating the next generation of Americans. So this concept cemented women in the domestic sphere, but it also opened up educational opportunities for women as well. In his 1787 treatise, Thoughts Upon Female Education, Benjamin Rush makes the case for educating women, supporting this concept of Republican motherhood. He states that they should be educated in the usual arts, such as sewing and housekeeping, but also in principles of liberty and government. He believed that she should know how to read, write, and keep accounts, that she should read history, philosophy, and astronomy. And this, of course, is all under the guise of being a good and useful partner to their husband and to provide a Republican education for their children. And though there was some opposition to women's education at the time, they were in the minority. And so this concept of Republican motherhood led to the growth in secondary schools and female academies. And secondary schools for women did exist in the 18th century. However, they were very few and they were for the very wealthy. Their main purpose was to stress ornamental skills like needlework, music, and dancing so that women would be more attractive to possible suitors. However, this concept of Republican motherhood essentially allowed for and encouraged the creation of female academies, which started sprouting out throughout the 1790s and grew in number into the early 19th century, predominantly in New England. These first academies were similar to those of the 18th century and were often created by women in their own homes. One popular example, of course, is Litchfield Academy, which was founded by Sarah Pierce in 1792. Pierce was from a middle-class artisan family. Her brother was looking to add an income to the family, so he sent her to school to become a teacher. And when she returned, she started teaching girls in her own home around the age of 25, and eventually opened up the school in 1792. And many of these early academies started off in homes and then grew in size, forming a reputation. Pierce's school was in Litchfield, which was one of the larger towns in the state, and it had many highly educated and prominent families. So many families began sending their daughters there to learn, but also to mingle in educated, wealthy circles. This watercolor here depicts Litchfield Academy as it stood in 1832. It was created by Emily Hart, who was the music instructor at the school. And so the school grew it so much in number that a new building was built. This one was purchased in 1827. The school taught over 3,000 girls from all over the country and even Canada and Ireland, so it really had a far reach. Another popular school was Susanna Rowson's Academy, which was in Boston, Massachusetts. Rowson is an interesting character. She was an actress and novelist and playwright, and she opened her school in 1797, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and ornamentals such as needlework. And she mostly catered to middle and upper class women. She even wrote her own school books for female academies, including this one here for geography. So what did the school year look like and how much did it cost to send women to these academies? This circular here is for a school for ladies in Middletown, Connecticut, and it states that there are 3 terms in a year, with the year costing a total of $32. This seems to be relatively normal since Rowson charged about $36 for a year at her academy. Now, this circular is from the 1840s and Rowson's school was in the 1790s, so there's a little bit of difference there. All payments were required quarterly in advance. And so we can see this receipt at the bottom corner for Amherst Academy, signed by Elmira Wheaton, who paid for 1/4 at the cost of $3, which is relatively less expensive than the circular here. So the amount you paid was based off of the type of school and the location of the school. Much like it is today, there were lots of options. Ornamentals, such as needlework and music, were an additional fee. So here they're charging $10 for music. Rowson charged $3 to $6 for her needlework or other ornamentals as well. And there was also a fee for boarding, which could be an additional $3 a week. If the school was large enough, many could stay at the school in the building, but many others had to board in homes throughout the town, often of well-known and pre-approved members of the community. And we actually have a list of pre-approved members on this circular here that people could reach out to. There was also a lot of social activities going on at these schools. So Sally Town writes in a letter to her parents while she was at school in Boston that she attended a military ball. So these events would also cost extra money as well, and they were important to attend since many women went to these schools to find appropriate husbands at the time. With the average income a day at the time being roughly 50 cents, this was expensive, and it did exclude several women from attending. Despite this, however, many families of little wealth were sending their daughters to Litchfield and other academies, mostly to get an education in order that they may be able to make money teaching, much like Sarah Pierce did. And Sarah and many others like her even helped her students find teaching positions afterwards or had them join the staff. And some of these girls even worked as district schools teachers or in mills to pay their way through school term by term. And Rebecca will talk more about some of the different forms of work that were available. Another thing of note is that the age ranges varied at these institutions. And so they were considered secondary forms of education, but there were girls there as young as 8 years old and as old as 28. So there was a wide range. And it really depended on your family's wealth and the reason for them sending you there. Young girls, of course, would start with samplers, as Rebecca mentioned. This one here was done by Martha Bird Knapp while she was at Rowson's Academy in 1807, and she was 9 years old when she created this. So this is one way to learn basic sewing skills that would prove useful in the creation of more elaborate needleworks, pictures, which were required more skill and patience, and which Rowson also did. They could learn how to create needlework pictures, watercolor, and draw. And so Rowson recognized that most of her pupils would become wives and mothers and likely would have domestic help to do basic sewing since most of them were from a higher social class. So these ornamental skills would give the girls something to occupy their free time. She did not tolerate idleness in her school, so the girls were constantly busy. Other ornamentals included these beautiful needlework pictures. So needlework such as this became popular around 1800, and these works were often based off of prints depicting classical mythology, biblical scenes, or scenes from contemporary literature, such as Shakespeare's writings. This is a beautiful needlework picture. It's titled Cymbeline, which is based off of a Shakespeare play, and it was wrought by Anne Soames Trask around 1812 while she was at Rowson's Academy. And it was common for these works, as I said, to be based off of English prints. And this one here is based off of this print, which we also have in our collection. As you can see, they're exactly the same. However, the girls were able to add their own colors and also their own designs as well. So they're making them their own. Working on these intricate pieces often coincided with reading related material. So it was possible that Anne was working on this piece while also listening to someone read Shakespeare. So these instructors, they tried to encourage constant learning. And this would likely have taken them the whole year to finish, and it would have been displayed at an exhibition at the end of the year. These were expensive pieces, not only for the additional teaching fee for ornamentals, but also for the materials, the silk cloth, the thread, the elaborate framing. So these were often put up in parlors as display of wealth, but they also kind of acted as a diploma of sorts as well. And often this is what survives in museum collections related to female academies. So eventually needlework went out of style and was painting on velvet, especially theorem painting, became more popular. So theorem painting involved the use of stencils, which were often made out of scraps of paper that were coated with a varnish so they could be reusable. Women decorated clothing like this velvet reticule, or they could use it to paint on paper, such as this family register, which was created by Elmira Wheaton in 1832. And though these subjects seemed frivolous, some middle-class women did pay a little more to learn them. So this certificate here certifies that Elmira Wheaton is qualified to teach theorem painting on velvet. So it was an equitable skill that people would pay a little extra money for, and it would make it easier for them to find teaching jobs in reputable academies after their education was complete. Elmira did eventually marry, and she used this technique to create the family register that we see here. So besides ornamentals, women were learning several different subjects, including reading, writing, arithmetic, rhetoric, grammar, French, history, astronomy, and geography, to name a few. Rowson and many others used the finer arts as an avenue to teach these new areas, and this in turn made learning these new subjects more appropriate and socially acceptable for women. So this map was made by Mehitable Stoddard Sumner while she was at Mrs. Butler's Academy in Hingham, Mass. And it demonstrates the type of things they were learning. So they were learning about global trade, colonialism, and the possessions of global powers at the time, and probably the different cultures in this area of the world. They were also learning complex forms of mathematics and astronomy. This is an arithmetic book of Elizabeth Jewett while she was at the Washington School in Pepperell, Massachusetts in 1830. And it again demonstrates that they were learning these complex forms of math and that they were also using drawing and the finer ornamental skills to supplement that learning as well. So though these schools were exclusionary based on wealth, they were also excluded women of color. The first school for women of color was created in Canterbury, Connecticut by Prudence Crandall in 1832. She opened the school in 1831 to members of the community and accepted her first student of color, Sarah Harris, in 1832. Fortunately, local families began withdrawing their girls from the school, so Prudence decided to officially turn the school into one for women of color the following year. However, the community protested and threatened Crandall and her students, and Connecticut eventually passed a law in 1832 which made it illegal for schools to teach people of color from other states. And so Crandall was arrested and jailed, and the school was vandalized, eventually forcing her to close its doors. In 1839, there were no more than 3 schools where a woman of color could achieve an advanced education in New England, as compared to the over 150 schools available for white women at the time. So it's in these academies that the first generation of American women leaders were trained. Women like Mary Lyon, Catherine Beecher, who attended Litchfield, and Emma Willard and Elizabeth Cady Stanton all attended female academies and went on to create their own women's schools and fight for women's education reform and rights. In these schools, they were able to develop intellectual interests with other young women and witness the leadership exhibited by the founding members of these schools. However, many of these women trivialized their education at these academies. Their biggest complaint was that the academy's focus was on ornamentals and they lacked subjects equal to those at men's schools. Many women and even men were commenting on the state of female education in the 1820s and 30s. Sarah Josepha Hale mentions in her article in the American Ladies magazine in 1835 what their main concerns were: that their education was superficial and that it was simply for display. Sure, a woman could get her diploma, but the options after school were very few. In fact, the purpose of their education was simply to be a good wife and mother, which, at the beginning of this discussion in the 1790s, was the main reason for the creation of these schools. So we see a great shift in the purpose of women's education by the 1830s. And so by the 1830s, a lot of these female academies are morphing into female seminaries or are closing their doors. And we see their curriculum starting to look more like male colleges, with the first being Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which was founded by Mary Lyon in 1837 in South Hadley, Massachusetts. So this school changed a few things. The school made the minimum entrance age 17 years old. So there was no more large variations in age. They strived to have a curriculum equal to those of male colleges, and they tried to make tuition more affordable by having the students perform domestic tasks, much like work study today. And they also required an entrance exam for students, so they had to prove that they had the foundational knowledge needed to attend the school. So female education had drastically changed since the late 18th century, and it would continue to evolve and change throughout the 19th century. These schools taught women how to negotiate between the ambitions generated by their education and the constraints inherent in conventional models of womanhood. So they were still women in the 19th century with strict gender roles, but they were able to open up more avenues of education for themselves, as well as new forms of employment.
There we go. Like Brittany was saying, education is kind of widening in a lot of ways. Employment opportunities for young ladies and women were also increasing, though there was a sort of a growing emphasis on some areas and professionalism and training, especially if you consider the sort of professionalization of the medical field and kind of limiting opportunities that traditionally had been women's domain in terms of midwives and things like that. So in many cases, a lot of the opportunities are still kind of, again, fitting within the established feminine spheres, even if the work was now, in some cases, outside of the home. So employment for young women fell into several categories, as you can see through this chart here. Working outside of the home, often as a temporary way to earn a living, working within the home to supplement the household finances, or working at a skilled and, in a lot of cases, socially acceptable trade in a shop or rented workspace or room out of a private home. So the majority of the women we're talking about would still eventually choose marriage and family. And in many cases, the duties of a household manager, wife, and mother would become their full-time job, so to speak. And employment was, for a lot of the young ladies, often a means to an end. So a way to earn money for further education, to add support to a household, or to experience a little bit of freedom, both literally and financially, before marriage. So by way of example, in 1832 in Worcester County, the largest employment spheres, as you can see here, were palm leaf hat making, followed by cotton textile manufacturing, straw braiding and bonnet making, woolen textile manufacturing, then shoemaking and binding, chair making and tailoring. So 2/3 of the women in this study in 1832 were working out of their homes. So things like palm and straw braid, shoe binding and other piecework would be examples of that. 1/3 were working outside of the home, and this again was largely in the textile processes, like the textile mills, cotton and woolen mills that you see there. The majority of these women were unmarried and young, so under 30. Other work included things like decorative painting or finish work, such as furniture, tinwares, comb and card making, hatting, twine making, pocketbook making. There were even a few ladies listed as being involved with instrument making. So there was some variety here. But it really should be noted that while these 1832 numbers include over 7,000 women, this only represents about 1/4 of the women in the area in Worcester County. So the vast majority of the women are not considered employed as such. And when considering women up to the age of 30, that number actually is much closer to 50%. So that really represents a distinct trend for the younger women engaging in temporary employment pursuits before eventually marriage and family. So there were numerous employment opportunities, as we mentioned, that you could pursue from home. So these just demonstrate a few of those. And this is really largely a way to supplement the family income. The tasks in central Massachusetts especially would have been straw braid and palm leaf hat making, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen there, followed by sewing shoe uppers or binding shoes. And these are definitely considered well within the sort of feminine sphere of what's acceptable for the use of women's skills and time. Piecework was also another opportunity to use one's skills for supplemental income, sewing and knitting, etc. And by way of example, the ladies of the Bixby House, which is originally from Barre, Massachusetts, and now here at Old Sturbridge Village, were braiding straw and sewing shoe uppers, as is evidenced by material leavings that were found in the house beneath the floorboards when the house was moved here. So it was uncovered as we were moving the house here in the early 1980s and engaging in some archaeological study at the site. So clearly, Laura Bixby and her teenage daughters were participating in this sort of broader network of women utilizing their skills within key manufacturing systems in central Massachusetts, but outside, or rather out of the home. There were still more opportunities to work at skilled trades. So this is often having learned the trade as a younger lady under the tutelage of a more experienced professional. And this would include things like millinery and dressmaking and tailoring. And some of these skilled trades women might have worked for a sort of broader extended period and supported themselves. You'll learn a little bit more later about Charity and Sylvia of Vermont. Charity Bryan and Sylvia Drake and Zerua Caswell of Castleton, Vermont, who all worked at sewing and tailoring for their communities and into their middle age. So after they were sort of outside of that cutoff of 30 years old that you saw in that first sort of lithograph. The silk bonnet that you see on the screen has a label for Mrs. P. Hinckley. She was a milliner in Hartford, Connecticut. We don't know too much about Mrs. Hinckley, but her business is listed in the city directories from 1825 through 1845. So that's showing, again, a longevity to her millinery business. And all of these folks, Rua, Sylvia, Charity, Mrs. Hinckley, may very well have had younger ladies kind of under their employ, learning the skills from them as professionals, and then possibly going on to open shops or work in that field for more long term. So the piece on the right-hand side, oh, sorry, the piece on the right-hand side kind of represents, I was talking a little bit about sort of ornamental skills. This is something that, again, is something that the women could be working outside of the home at, decoratively painting or finishing things like the painted tin or kind of other finish work rather. So some young ladies may have taken their artistic skills that could have been learned at an academy and kind of put them into this sort of area for employment. And it really should be noted that even while they're working in the same industry with men, the men and women were almost always performing different parts of the production process with different tools. And a lot of times the women were working towards that more artistic skill and heavily concentrated on tasks involving needle skills, textile production, work with fibers, and then decorative surfaces like you see on this tin box here. So educational work and teaching was an option for young women as well. Oops, nope, sorry about that. Textile mills first, because that ties in a little bit better. So textile mills were rising to prominence throughout New England, and they offered another opportunity for young women to work outside of the home. So many mills, Lowell being a good example, were actively recruiting young ladies from surrounding towns and farming families to work. The mills were framing themselves as genteel places to work. So though the young women were outside of the home in the domestic sphere, the women were staying in, for instance, boarding houses that were run by married couples or older single women, much like some of the approved places that young ladies attending some of those academies could be boarding at. There were strict codes of conduct. There were dress codes that were enforced. So this is all encouraging moral, genteel, pious behavior and appropriate modest dress while you're working in this mill system. So even though the mills were a factory setting and outside the home, the textile work still fell within that sphere of domestic women's work and did not immediately threaten the status quo. The strict codes of conduct that the young ladies were expected to adhere to really also helped this notion that the factory setting would not be disruptive to society's gendered roles. The young women participating in textile mill work were also encouraged to pursue self-improvement through various pursuits and social movements. One such movement was the establishment of the Lowell Offering, which you see here on the screen. It was a literary magazine that was established in 1840 by a Universalist minister, and it quickly gained popularity among the mill girls, many of whom were encouraged and inspired to contribute various literary works from short stories to poetry, and it should be noted that Lucy Larcom was one of the contributors. So another one that we have referenced before, Susan Blunt, who's growing up in Manchester, New Hampshire, and in particular around the Amskey Mills, which were established in 1837, related that a number of young girls my age, and many that were older, worked in the mills. Some of the girls were ambitious for an education and would save up their money to go away to some school. So there's really a link between female employment and education. And it's a little bit fluid, as some were working for their education and others were educating themselves for work. And it really should be noted too that this sort of perception of mill work and the reality were often vastly different. So the very periodical that sought to encourage women's betterment became in some cases kind of an outlet for their voices and critiques of the system. So factory work was arduous. Hours were long, conditions were often unsafe and sometimes outright dangerous. And there were instances of labor unrest and strikes and kind of growing critiques of the mill system. But again, as you saw with some of the female academies and seminaries, women had to tread carefully to kind of stay within this established sphere, and straying too far outside of that realm was often rebuked as unseemly and unfeminine and ultimately kind of against the societal norms. So another area that you would find women working in, again, as Brittany alluded to, was women in education. And this takes kind of a few different forms. So teaching was an option for young women, and many felt that women were particularly well suited to instructing the youngest children, as you see here, kind of as an extension of their natural maternal instinct, their sort of gentle feminine demeanor and moral and temperate dispositions and ability to guide through example. Not to mention that tending and educating children was definitely within their feminine sphere and expected. So while women were often sought out for summer terms in district schools in particular, due to this sort of youthful and female demographic, they had the advantage, for the town at least, of being paid substantially less than their male counterparts. So a lot of times the towns would prefer men for the winter terms with the older demographic, as they are thought to be more disciplinary and a little bit more in charge, but save a little bit of money by hiring a woman in the summer months. And while keeping school, it wouldn't be uncommon for young ladies, again, to board with various families in the community. So they're not necessarily keeping school within the same school that they just came out of. So you can imagine, though, because you've got all of those ages, as we were talking about early, from 2, 3, 4 years old, all the way up to 16 or 17 or 18 years old, it would be really hard to keep discipline in a room full of your acquaintances and former classmates that you may have just left the semester before. So other young ladies, though, took their more advanced academic training and taught at female seminaries and other higher education institutions for women. Many young ladies, again, taught for a fairly short amount of time before eventually marrying and motherhood. So teaching was really another way for a young lady, in a lot of ways, to experience a little measure of freedom, again, personal and financial, getting outside of your own town before settling down as society kind of expected you to. But it was a way to kind of experience your sort of social surroundings too. So you'll find that this is a time where young women might be expanding their social circles as well.
So, though there were avenues of school and work that increased throughout the early 19th century for women, they were often supplementary to marriage, as Rebecca mentioned. Post-Revolutionary War culture idealized marriage and the place of woman as the mother or Republican mother. And for most New England women during the early 19th century, the path to adulthood culminated with their marriage at about the age of 22. She would leave her childhood home, her school friends, and her job, if she had one, to become a full-time wife and mother. Financial security, personal welfare, pregnancy, and of course love were some of the many factors that influenced a woman's decision to form a partnership. A minority of early New Englanders never married. They remained unattached for various reasons, from fear of acting on their sexual orientation to financial constraints, family obligations, religious strictures, or even a fear of childbirth. Some never met the right partner or experienced mental illness or physical limitations. In a strongly patriarchal society that stripped married women of financial and many legal rights, some women sought autonomy by remaining single. As Susan B. Anthony wrote, I would not object to marriage if it were not that women throw away every plan and purpose of their own life to conform to the plans and purposes of the man's life. Especially with these new avenues of work and education, some women could afford to support themselves through teaching, writing, or skilled crafts such as tailoring. Lucy Larcom, in fact, never married. Instead, she dedicated her life to writing, and she documented that life in A New England Girlhood. Other women may have simply not been interested in men. Because women often spend most of their time with each other, loving relationships did form. It was considered normal for women and men to form emotional attachments with people of the same gender at this time, and these relationships could and did evolve into romantic love. Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake provide an amazing example of a same-sex couple in the 19th century. Neither showed interest in courting men in their youth. Instead, they shared a desire to learn, write, and meet like-minded women. The strong relationships they formed with other women led to rumors and speculation, which eventually led Charity to leave Massachusetts and move to Weybridge, Vermont, where she met Sylvia. By July of 1807, Charity and Sylvia were inseparable. In Weybridge, they began their lives together by establishing a tailoring business, leasing land, and building a house. They embedded themselves in the community. They taught Sunday school and organized charitable societies. And their devotion to these local causes endeared them to their neighbors. And it allowed their relationship to essentially be an open secret, even though it was outside the law at the time. They were described as husband and wife, each adopting a traditional gender role within the relationship. Charity, who was considered the head of the household, took care of their finances, while Sylvia performed most of the domestic duties. They found a way to make their relationship work within the confines of their society, and they lived together as a loving couple until Charity's death in 1805. They are buried under a single headstone in Weybridge, and this silhouette, as well as their surviving papers, are at the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, Vermont. For those who did marry in the traditional sense, the act of courting was an important step. By the end of the 18th century, marriage was no longer solely about financial or familiar obligations. Rather, the focus was on romantic love, on finding a partner to live amicably with for the rest of your life. And since marriage was a lifelong commitment, this was an important decision. And while parents were expected to be consulted, they were not the final say in most cases. In general, marriage was regarded as a solemn decision. Women did have a say in who they married, and they were encouraged to choose wisely and based off of their intuition. This gave them more freedom, but it also gave them more pressure to make the right choice. Advice literature for young women warned that if a husband turned out to be intemperate, shiftless, or just unlucky, his wife and children would be vulnerable to poverty, social isolation, humiliation, and even moral ruin. So there was a lot of at stake in this decision process, and so people did not generally rush into marriage. Women often married between the ages of 20 to 27, while men married between 24 and 30. In order to marry, the couple needed to be self-supporting. So men were encouraged to find a trade or profession, to buy land or start a business. They needed to be able to support the wife and family. So this left a lot of time for courting opportunities. Women and men could meet at balls, at dancing schools, sleighing parties, quilting bees or husking bees, which we have pictured here on the left-hand side of the screen, my left. So husking bees were when at the end of the season, when all the corn was collected, the farmer needed to husk the corn, and so the community would come and help and husk the corn. And then afterwards, they would have like a little party essentially. And what would happen is the older generation and the younger generation would kind of split, and they would have their own parties. So lots of socializing occurred at this point as well. So the couple were the ones making the decision to spend more time with each other in these situations. And even though there was pressure to pick a good temperate husband, love and affection and emotional and spiritual compatibility were a large part of the decision. We are lucky enough to have the courtship letters of Lucius Benham and Sarah Plimpton within our research library collection. Lucius Benham lived in West Haven, Connecticut, where he met Sarah Plimpton of Sturbridge, Mass, while she was teaching at Oak Hill Female Seminary. When Sarah left town to attend to her sister, Lucius wrote to Sarah expressing his interest in forming the most intimate relation of life with her. Sarah was hesitant, but agreed to at least correspond with him, and so Lucius and Sarah exchanged letters for 16 months, slowly learning more about each other's lives, characters, beliefs, and opinions. She asked about his financial stability and his expectations of a wife. He asked how she thought children should be raised and what kinds of renovations they should make to the house. At one point, Sarah writes to her brother Salem for advice on the match. He was the head of the family and he was also a minister, so he had lots of questions for Sarah, but he also ended his letter with some really sage advice. He writes, "But all these questions and others of like character are only preliminary and outside of the main question. That question is whether you do or can love him with such strength and warmth of devotion as to be willing for his sake to bear all the trials and disappointments and sufferings of life. You may be well assured that without such affection, married life will be a most miserable life, whatever advantage of circumstances you may have. Never consent to give your hand unless your heart is fully in it." And with this sage advice, Sarah decided to accept Lucius' marriage proposal, and they were married in May of 1854. So once a couple decided to marry, they needed to apply to the clerk of the town or towns where they lived. The clerk would then publish the couple's intent to marry or marriage bans. Alternatively, a minister could announce their marriage intentions at 3 consecutive Sunday services. And this process allowed people in the community time to raise any objections to the marriage in case either party had been previously married or they were unknowingly distantly related to each other. Once that step was over, the wedding was typically held in the home of the bride's family, and we have here a country wedding. The minister or justice of the peace would perform the ceremony. The he would have the he Most wedding ceremonies were briefs, and he would have the couple hold each other's right hand. The pair didn't exchange vows, but they agreed to love and honor each other in sickness and health as long as they lived, much as modern couples do today. They usually did not exchange rings as part of the wedding ceremony. If a groom could afford it, he might give his bride to be a gold engagement band that would also serve as the wedding ring. But this was expensive, and so it was not universal at the time. This bride appears to have an attendant, likely a sister or a close friend, and it was becoming common for the bride and bridegroom to have a friend or relative stand by them and witness the marriage. Weddings were small celebrations with a few friends, neighbors, and family members in attendance. Since long distance travel was not yet convenient in the early 19th century, only local guests were present at the ceremony. Even the groom's family might not attend if they lived farther away. After the wedding, the newly married couple and their guests would often have simple refreshments, typically a small glass of fortified wine and fruitcake. The bride in this painting is wearing a white dress. However, it was not common for wedding dresses to be white at this time. That only occurs after Queen Victoria's marriage. Most surviving wedding dresses from the early 19th century are in a range of colors. This one here is the wedding dress of Julia Ann Eldridge, likely for her second marriage in 1835. It is made of this beautiful olive-colored figured silk. The groom would also wear his best clothing, such as this black tailcoat here, and these garments were often worn again and sometimes even altered later in their lives, and were not preserved in the same sense that we preserve gowns today. Overall, the ceremony was very short with a small number of guests, much different from our modern weddings. And then once the wedding ceremony was over, married life would then begin.
So the reality, as we've been talking about for a lot of women, was becoming a young housewife and a mother. And increasingly throughout this, women were regarded and idealized as a stabilizing force, kind of unmoved by society. And this idealization of young women's roles led to the reality for young women that they would choose marriage, domestic duties, and raising a family. So much so that Living Right Child really cautioned against the trend for young ladies to be led into marriage prematurely because their friends had suitors, and really to consider their prospective partners carefully and not to be so enamored by the idea of needing to be settled down that they made an unwise or hasty choice, as you saw with the letter there in the case of Lucius and his intended. So women were praised for their ability to manage a household, management of domestic finances and workflow. And really, this was sort of their natural sphere, or considered to be their natural sphere. Lydia Maria Child in The American Frugal Housewife was praising women for their ability to be frugal and manage the household expenses and keep things running smoothly and keep all members of the family, including the children, gainfully occupied, and railed against frivolous educational pursuits at the expense of practical domestic education, and provides various case studies of women who she felt embodied her advice with their careful, frugal ways and how happy their household was, versus those who did not embody that advice, and how sort of disastrous it was for their future. And she says, there's no subject so much connected with individual happiness and natural prosperity as the education of daughters. The situation and prospects of a country may be justly estimated by the character of its women. And of course, Lydia Maria Child is speaking not only to scholastic education, but in particular the practical domestic education, and kind of instilling the proper character, modesty, lack of vanity, work ethic, mindfulness, and spending that a young wife and mother should have. So she found herself with a variety of jobs to manage that occupied a great deal of her time. Leisure time could still be found. Idleness was not a virtue for many folks in the early 19th century, but that didn't mean that you couldn't combine handwork or other small tasks with visiting and kind of other social enjoyments throughout your day, particularly in the afternoon after your sort of heaviest tasks like the cooking that you see happening on the right-hand side of the screen was done. So the reality of this is really demonstrated in one of our favorite pieces in the collection, which is an unfinished needlework embroidery. It was wrought by Emily Goodwin, probably circa 1806 or so. Emily married Daniel Poor in 1806, and at this point would likely have put this embroidery aside unfinished, as household duties and later child rearing, because they did have children, would have taken precedence. So it's really kind of funny to also note, as a little bit of an aside, that we've had this in our collection for many, many, many years. And recently, back in 2014, we got a large donation from the estate of the wife of OSV's first curator. So Malcolm Watkins was the first curator, his wife's estate, Joan Pearson Watkins. And tucked into this little red covered trunk was an assortment of embroidery pieces and socks and little bits and bobs. And tucked in with a lovely little granny note was, "This is the embroidery of Emily Elizabeth Poor." And that kind of rang a bell. And sure enough, Emily Elizabeth is Emily Goodwin's daughter. So we were able to kind of reunite mother's embroidery with daughter's embroidery. But of course, the embroidery there, as soon as she starts that family, this is something that she probably doesn't have a lot of time, as you heard from Brittany, that this is something that would have taken a great deal of time and care for a young lady to work on and complete. So she married very, very young. She married at 16, which is very unusual for the early 19th century, and would have put this away at that point. So here you see a lovely domestic scene. During the first half of the 19th century, the family size was shrinking from generations earlier, so down to an average of 5 to 6 children, but still considerably larger than the family size today. And that meant women could expect to spend a significant time either pregnant or nursing and raising infants. Pregnancy could generally be expected every 2 years for many women throughout her childbearing years, which might be from the sort of early mid-20s all the way up through the 40s in a lot of cases. And women, of course, were expected to be a gentle, positive maternal influence and nurturing their children. So here you see the kind of ideal sort of family scenario. This shows Enoch Tuttle and his wife Hannah. They had more children after Darius and James, the 2 little boys there, and it really shows that sort of tidy scene of domestic peace with well-behaved children. One is handing his mother a bouquet of flowers, the other is handing his father an apple. There's a lovely little cat sitting under the table. So this is sort of that early 19th century, mid-19th century ideal of what your family should be like. Everything neat and orderly, everybody dressed nicely, everything running smoothly. That was not necessarily always the case. So the next slide shows something that might look a little familiar. The lovely family register that was done by Elmira Wheaton in 1833. She married 2 years later in 1835 and started to fill in all of the dates as various children were born. And the reality for a lot of women is that it was not always something that was safe. So a lot of folks were experiencing complications and death after childbirth, or certainly childhood mortality was very, very high in the early 19th century. And this one's a little bit tough because you see that within a day, she lost 4 children. So it kind of puts it into reality that for a lot of folks, it's expected that they will be marrying and raising children, but the reality of that is that it's also very tenuous for both women and their children. So it's kind of, you have to sort of temper the ideal with what's actually happening for a lot of women, young women. But advice books and kind of going back again to the Republican motherhood and this sort of idealizing of motherhood and sort of the importance of maternal influence. Parenting manuals are abounding, particularly for young mothers in the early 19th century. And one theme of many of these manuals, beyond the practical sort of ins and outs of how to care for your infant, was the idea of Republican motherhood, which had a strong hold on the ideals set for young mothers and wives. And there was a growing romanticism and kind of sentimentality around womanhood, and young mothers who were suited to the sort of moral guardianship of their young offspring. And they were increasingly seen as sort of the center of this domestic realm, which included gentle religious teachings and moral guidance as sort of and practical education. And they were really starting to be sort of idealized as a stabilizing force in the sea of changes, sort of above external societal matters. And a heightened sense of importance was given to keeping that domestic sphere and the children and men by default in the country as a whole, no pressure there, as sort of running smoothly. One advice book both praised Washington's mother and damned Byron's mother for their influences, for the maternal influence positive in Washington's case and decidedly negative in Lord Byron's case, had forever left its mark on their childhood and was thus responsible for their character in adulthood. So again, Living Right Child, stated in The American Frugal Housewife, in the early childhood, you really lay the foundation of poverty or riches and the habits you give to your children. And the situation and prospects of a country may be justly estimated by the character of its women. So this idea that women are really sort of the center of the home and by default, the center of society and kind of keeping everything running smoothly on a lot of different levels. So, related to this in a lot of ways, as it connected to young women and their moral influence on society, was the rise of female led societies and groups, often centered around appropriate moral cases, such as charity and temperance and religion and motherhood, and eventually abolition. And these causes all related strongly to sort of women's duty to effect social and moral and religious change through their sphere. But again, as you saw with other things, particularly with education, within these societies, change was coming. And it was sort of, you're seeing the beginnings of this feminist critique of the status quo, particularly as it related to women's voices in the public sphere. So while many young women were embracing, whether willingly or otherwise, to sort of their behind the scenes role as guiding moral forces for the family and society, other young women were definitely starting to push back against society's gender norms and expectations and kind of using their voices to affect some change. So broadly, the experiences of young ladies coming of age in the early 19th century really varied widely. And it's kind of fascinating to take a look at some of these young ladies' lives through material culture.
Awesome. So we have a few minutes for some questions. We ran a little long. I'm sorry. We had a lot to say. So we have a few questions. One is, were the requirements of bands a national thing or a New England thing? She's writing a romance set in Indiana around the 1830s. I want to say it was a national thing, right, Rebecca? I'm thinking it was a national thing. I think it wasn't
I
just New
believe
England.
so. Yeah, I
Yeah.
believe so.
And I think the tradition might have been the same in England as well and some other places also. So definitely a national thing. Another question we have is, did women have any knowledge of contraception at the time?
That is a really good question. Do you want to take it or do you want me to take it?
You can take it.
So there were definitely various methods. Um, So women then and now, you get to know your body, shall we say. So you could, between nursing and pregnancy and kind of tracking, you could kind of, to a certain extent, engage. And there certainly were people who were, the Bixbys had 3 children, for instance, and it's, did they choose that way, or was that just how sort of nature doled out how many children they had? There were male condoms as well that could be purchased. So there's kind of a little measure of control on both sides.
I think there are also some like herbal remedies
Yes.
as well that might have worked
Yes.
also. So,
Um,
you know, women had their own knowledge as well. A
yeah.
lot of it's not written down, unfortunately, but there were ways. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Things like tansy and sort
Mhm.
of this knowledge of like if you are expecting, stay away from the tansy. So there were ways that women could control as well, if they thought they might be expecting.
Oh, okay. One more question just popped up. How many hours might a young girl have for playing between chores and school?
That's a really good question. I think the answer is it really depends on the family. It depends on your economic level. So certainly those who had more wealth would have a little bit more free time. So you'll find folks who have more wealth, maybe having the means and not needing their children's help as much so they can send them away to school or get a little more playtime in. But it also tends to depend a bit on the family. Like today, some parents are a little bit more strict and require more chores. Others are happy to let their children kind of go out and play. So there's really no hard and fast rule. But certainly for a lot of families in our area, especially those engaged in agriculture, all hands on deck. So you really need to be able to count on the children for their help as well. And it wouldn't be uncommon to have a variety of ages in the family. So maybe the older girls are taking more and more responsibility, not only for household chores like cooking and cleaning, but also for minding the little ones too. So it really ranges. It depends a lot on the family.
That seems to be our last question. If anyone has any final thoughts, feel free to share. Otherwise, if you have a question that you think of later, feel free to send us an email at the email at the bottom of the screen here. All right, so thank you all for joining us. If you did not catch the entire program, oh, we just had a question pop up. Oh, just thanks. Thank you very much. This says, thanks for the answers of this presentation. Very informative. Thank you very much. All right, so if you didn't catch the entire program or you would like to share it, a recording of the webinar will be sent to our members in the following week, and it will also be uploaded to the Old Sherbridge Village YouTube page. And thank you again to Rebecca for joining me tonight and to all of you as well. I hope you all have a great evening.